Hey, everybody, welcome to Contra Talk. My name is Richard Henry, and this is the first episode in the new season of Contra Talk. It's a podcast, both audio and if you want to listen and watch, you can watch on YouTube. We have many people lined up for the season. I've got several other episodes that will be launching on this channel. This is a new channel. I've got another basically sister channel called Richard Contramundum. That was my primary channel, still is. But that deals with cultural and church related stuff. I'm a pastor in the SBC, so I talk a lot about that and kind of corruption and this and this and this and teaching and things that are happening in the world, a little bit more current events. But I always use scripture. I seek to try and bring scripture to bear what Christ would have us do in that time. There's shorts on there and other things. I've got older interviews as well on that channel. So from now on, I'm going to have Contra Talk exclusively on this channel. And today's episode is with Gary Demar. I have several other episodes with him. It's on the Richard Contramundum channel, and will be eventually on this. I'll probably do like a throwback Thursday where I upload an old episode, and new episodes will drop on Saturday with Contra Talk. So it is Saturday. If you're watching this premiered or recorded later, this is when it dropped. So look out for that. This interview is wonderful. We talk more about end times and just related topics, and really how Christians have had a wrong view a lot of times in the last, especially 100 years. And we've abdicated a lot of our responsibility with government, with teaching our children, with media, with art, with many, many things. And unfortunately, we've been trying to be intentional with it, or unintentional consequences that just didn't work out. Things that we thought would work, being intentional, but it actually proved to be opposite. Or not doing something was actually also really bad. So it's a really good conversation. He's the president of American Vision. It's a ministry down in Worldview Ministry, deals with not just end times, but overall just personal responsibility of a Christian and training children, training Christians, believers, and being evangelistic and all the rest. So very biblical, very encouraging. I hope you find this conversation well. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you haven't. That way you'll see the new Contra Talks dropping, as well as go over and find Richard Contramundum. You can subscribe to that channel as well. I'll put that in the description. Just trying to use this platform and be specific in certain areas, and trying to use the big tech giants against themselves. So y'all take care and enjoy the conversation. Hey everybody, welcome to Contra Talk. My name is Richard Henry, and I've got a returning guest, Gary Demar. We're going to be talking about eschatology and a bunch of just wonderful things, American heritage a bit, and a lot of pressing questions that people continually have. I'm very thankful for Gary and returning to the program. I think this is the fourth time, maybe fifth time you've been on the show.
Is that many?
I think so. It's at least 4. So welcome to the show again, Gary. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's great. This is much better than having to travel places. Although I am doing an interview up in Hendersonville, North Carolina. They actually want me in studio.
Oh, okay.
But we're going to make a little vacation out of it because it's a little south of Asheville.
And, that's a nice area. Yeah.
So anyway, this is much better this way. And most of the interviews I did in the past were radio interviews by telephone.
Oh, sure. So kind of the same thing.
This new technology has changed. It changed everything.
We have to put on a nice shirt in the process, right? You can't.
Yeah.
And I
even have pants on, so just to show you, I'm prepared just in case I have to get up for anything.
There you go. I know that was a big thing during 2020 with Zoom calls and stuff.
Yeah.
So we've addressed a lot of things, and those maybe who are just tuning in or listening for the first time, I've got quite a few other episodes I'll link in the description where Gary's answered different questions. One was actually a live that we did. We had basically an audience similar to how radio is and was. But today we're going to try and tackle some other and kind of get into some other questions. A lot of these were actually questions that popped up on prior videos in the description saying, well, isn't it just this? Or I don't understand the post-mill thing. Why doesn't it blank? Or I thought it was this way, but now it's that way, you're saying. So there's most of these are actual questions from viewers and listeners. So we're just going to jump right in. First question. There's a few passages in Matthew, for example, that I think a lot of people don't pay attention to as far as being eschatological. Matthew 24, maybe, but there's also Matthew 10, Matthew 16. Can you flesh out, just kind of give a summary, if you will, of why those passages and maybe how they fit in the gospel and why Christ is talking the way he's doing in those times?
Yeah, I think we have to remember, and I think this is where a lot of people get confused about this. They start reading the New Testament, and anytime they read something, they take it out of its historical context and the immediate audience. It's like you and I are talking right now. This is the immediate audience. So anything we talk about right now, if this were a piece of history, people would have to understand what you and I are talking about in terms of the technology of the day. I mean, someone in the future right now look at this and they say these guys were dealing with some ancient technology, and so forth and so on. So you have to understand the historical context of what is going on and the original audience. To whom is Jesus speaking? And the application of that. So Christians oftentimes confuse, when it comes to eschatology, an eschatology that was specific to Israel's eschatology, and then maybe generalized eschatology. And so, for example, Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is very specific here. He's dealing with the cities of Israel. I mean, he says that. It's I'm going to get my Bible here and pull this up so I get all this right.
I've got it too.
And so people read this sort of thing, and then they say, "Boy, I can't." And this is what happened to me when I first became a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
This was in 1973. I was a student at Western Michigan University, and a lot of people, your younger audience, you're compared to me, you're young as well. 1973, we think of the Left Behind books, which came out in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was actually in the 80s. I think it was in the 80s.
It might have been the 80s, yeah.
In 1970, Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth came out, and that was a huge, huge seller. Actually, most people don't realize this. It was a bigger seller than the Left Behind series, because that single volume sold in the 20 million or so copies, one volume. Now, the Left Behind series has sold like 85 million copies, but they're like 13 or 14 different volumes.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so Late Great Planet Earth, remember, Israel became a nation again in 1948. Hal Lindsey says this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. The generation was 40 years. Mm-hmm. So you had 40 to 1948, you get 1988.
Right.
So this book came out in the 70s, and so people were looking to 1988 as a significant prophetic event. And what's interesting about this is that what Hal Lindsey and these guys were talking about was Israel's eschatology.
Mm-hmm.
Because when the supposed rapture took place, God was going to deal with Israel again. And I think this has completely confused a lot of people. And of course, in order to get there, the prophecy clock had to stop. And we have this parenthesis called the church age, and then God would deal with Israel again.
Yeah.
But if you got rid of that parenthesis and just took it out and put everything back the way it was, God was first dealing with Israel in the first century. That's what this is all about. How was God going to fulfill his promises to Israel? And so what the dispensationalists have to do is say, well, God's going to have to do this again. Mm-hmm. He's going to have an antichrist. The temple's going to have to be rebuilt. Animal sacrifices, another Jewish Holocaust, and so forth and so on. But if you take that parenthesis out and get it all back together again, all these events took place in that first century. And so when you look at Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, it says, "And having summoned his 12 disciples, he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness." Now, we read this and we think this is the idea that, when you pray to God, God's going to heal all your sicknesses and so forth. This took place then, but it had a very there's a covenantal reason for this. because you couldn't enter the temple under the old covenant with these various diseases and so forth. You could only get so far. And so Jesus is healing. All the healing Jesus does shows you that we're now in a new covenant era, that what's going to happen under the new covenant, that temple isn't going to exist anymore, and there is a new temple, the Lord Jesus Christ, and it is in him that we can go with all of our infirmities, and we don't have to worry about our physical maladies anymore in terms of temple purity. Now, it says, then he lists the names of the disciples, of the 12 apostles. Now look at verse 5. These 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, saying, do not go in the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So Jesus is directing this specifically to Israel, not directing this to the world, not directing this beyond the cities of Israel. And then you get, I won't go through all of this, but if you look then verse 16, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves, but be aware of men, for they will deliver you up to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. And all you have to do is look at Mark chapter 13, verse 9, where Jesus also says the same thing. Then verse 18, and you shall even be brought before governors and kings for my name's sake, as a testimony to them, to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not become anxious about how or what you will speak, for it shall be given to you in that hour what you are to speak. For it is not you who speak, but is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. And see, this, you read the book of Acts, and this is exactly what was taking place in the book of Acts. They were brought before governors, they were brought before courts. The persecution was taking place. Second Corinthians chapter 11, the Apostle Paul was beaten, 40 stripes less one, which was a Jewish punishment. Paul was on trial more from the Jews than he was from the Romans. In fact, the Romans didn't really care about what the Romans really didn't care about this squabble that was happening between unbelieving Jews and believing Jews. In fact, I think it's in Revelation, Acts chapter 19, the civil magistrate says, "Get out of here! Handle this your own way. This doesn't interest me at all." Right. It was the Jews who continue to try to use the civil magistrate in order to affect punishment on the early church, which was made up for a long time exclusively of Jews. Yeah. Then if you go to verse 23, but whenever they persecute you in this city, who's he talking about here? He's not talking about us. He's talking about them. And he talks about which city is he talking about? Well, he's talking about Jerusalem. Flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. So this passage has nothing to do with some future coming of Jesus. It has to do with a judgment coming of Jesus on that generation. And that's verse 19. But when they deliver you up, do not become anxious about how or what you will speak, for it shall be given to you in that hour what you are to speak. And you think of Pentecost. The Apostle Peter stands up at Pentecost, and all of a sudden it says, is this the same Peter who asked some somewhat ridiculous questions during Jesus' ministry, and he's the one who abandoned Jesus and denied Jesus 3 times? This is the same Peter? No, this is the same Peter, but something happened to him, and it was through the Holy Spirit. So this passage doesn't mean that you and I can go out there and we don't have to prepare for anything, because the Holy Spirit's going to give us what we're going to talk about. So this is effective to what is happening in that particular generation. So Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, when I became a new Christian, I started reading the Gospels, and in the back of my mind is a late great planet Earth, which was put in my hand and saying, this is what's going to happen. I started reading Matthew's Gospel and said, well, wait a minute. I didn't know enough about the Bible to question anything. Yeah. I did have enough common sense to know that what this passage was saying didn't fit with what you find with Hal Lindsey in the late great planet Earth, and so many more modern day prophecy teachers. Yeah. And no, that's a good point. Yeah, you get to Matthew 16, 27. It says, "For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds." And that is also quoted in Jude verses 14 and 16. "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here, not you're here or my here, but they're here, who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
Mm.
And so Jesus is saying that some very significant eschatological event is going to come, and it's going to be a judgment event. And that judgment event is going to be on that generation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is fleshed. If you just keep reading through Matthew's gospel, you get to chapter 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. It's all talking about this same period of time and the same people. And actually in Matthew chapter 21, verse 45, Jesus is dealing with the religious leaders of the day, and they understood it. It was very, very specific. It says, and they said, "Oh, Jesus is talking about us. He's not talking. This isn't describing something in the distant future. If you get this right, if you get Israel's eschatology right, it puts puts it all in a better perspective in terms of how to deal with Bible prophecy, and so much of the New Testament deals with the prophetic system of that particular day, and it was a completion of God's covenant with Israel, which was supposed to come to an end in this way anyway. And then a new covenant was to be established that didn't have all the trappings of the old covenant with a temple and animal sacrifices, because Jesus now is a substitute for all that."
Mm. Wow. And Matthew 24 is kind of like the would you say that's the peak? I know you mentioned there was Marcellus Kik. He's got an old book called Matthew 24, right? And that kind of rocked your world way back when you read it. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I was in seminary at that time. I became a Christian in 1973. I went to seminary in 1974. I wouldn't recommend that to most people, but I needed a quick education, and someone said, "Yeah, well, Gary, you ought to just go to seminary." So I went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, and I had put the eschatology stuff on the shelf because there were more immediate things for me to do, like learning Greek, So, but it was still an issue because the late great planet Earth was still big in that day. In fact, there was an interview with Hal Lindsey in 1977. I think it was the April issue of Christianity Today, where Hal Lindsey was interviewed, and what's his name, Ward Gasquet, asked Hal Lindsey, says, "What if you're wrong?" And Hal Lindsey says, "Well, there's only a split-second difference between being a hero and a bum." And he says, "I guess if I'm wrong, I'll be a bum." Well, he was wrong. Edgar Wisnett was wrong in 88 Reasons Why the Rapture was 1988. But these prophetic speculators are still out there using the same Bible passages that have been refuted over and over and over and over again, and are used by liberals actually to say, well, Jesus was mistaken about his first coming, and because he's wrong about all that, he's probably wrong about other things. He was just like any other man who thought he was a prophet. Well, he wasn't wrong. It was very specific to the very generation that took place. And so this book, when I was in seminary, the librarian was selling some of the books from his library, and I saw on the library cart I saw this red hardback, and it just had Matthew 24 on the spine in Roman numerals, and I bought it, and it completely changed my way of looking at the Bible. I had been told in seminary that you're supposed to use the Bible to interpret the Bible, and everybody is told that.
Go figure.
Very few people are actually told how to do it. And I have a short hermeneutics course if anyone is interested, and I show you how to do this. But what Marcellus Kik did is he went through Matthew chapter 24, and he compared it with other scriptures. He took the time text very, very seriously. Matthew 24:34. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And I read that. It says, well, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. When I read that, I immediately thought, well, Jesus was talking about that generation.
Mhm.
And if you read Matthew chapter 11 and Matthew chapter 12 and Matthew chapter 17, you will see that the phrase "this generation" is used repeatedly. And it always refers to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking. Now, people try to get around this. Oh, it means this race of people. It means this kind of generation, or it's the generation that'll see these signs. And I said, well, yeah, I agree. It means the generation that will see these signs. And it was that generation that saw those signs. Look at Matthew chapter 24:33. Jesus says, when you see these signs, and you'll know that the kingdom of God is near, right at the door. Well, he's talking about them. And all those signs took place before that generation passed away. And a lot of people say, what do you mean talking the sun going dark and the moon going dark and stars falling from heaven? I say,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll give you a good example of this. I told you before we started, I was at a funeral on Sunday. A good friend of mine, Marshall Foster. If we get into America's Christian heritage stuff, we may talk a little bit about Marshall. But Marshall Foster, longtime friend, and he was in the area of America's Christian history. Well, he became very good friends with Kirk Cameron, and Kirk Cameron was, as you know, he starred in the Left Behind series.
Mm-hmm.
And Kirk was there as well. Kirk had befriended Marshall had befriended Kirk. Marshall had introduced Kirk to my material, an eschatology series I did on Matthew chapter 24, and it really transformed his life. In fact, I have a 6-minute interview I did with Kirk on Sunday.
Cool. Nice.
Where he actually says that I rocked his world on the eschatology, watching this video series I had done, and I took him through Matthew 24, verse by verse in that particular series, and he said, well, Gary, he convinced me on this one. I'm going to put the next one in, and then the DVD, and put the next one in. Then he got to the sun, moon, and stars language of Matthew chapter 24, and he says there's no way he could convince me that the sun, moon, and stars reference there was fulfilled before that generation passed away. And I always ask the question to anybody, I said, what would be the only thing that would convince you of this? Don't take my view, because I might be considered an authority on this. Don't take my view. Compare Scripture with Scripture.
Right.
And so he put that DVD in with that lesson, and I had convinced him. Now, I had convinced him because I used the Bible.
Yeah.
Because if you look at Matthew chapter 24, and this is probably old hat for a lot of people who are here are listening to this right now, but a lot of people, have never heard this before. And and I'm telling you, everything I've told you so far, none of this is new stuff. Right. This isn't some new group of people coming along and saying, we found something that no one else has ever found in history.
Right.
You go back and look at the old commentators, you will see that this is old stuff. And so verse 29, and a lot of people will go read over chapter 24, 1 through 28, and they'll say, yes, when you get to Matthew 24, 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And they say, yes, that refers to the destruction of Jerusalem that took place before that generation passed away. And there are D.A. Carson, who's a great Bible commentator, has a great commentary on Matthew, and he takes that position all the way up through Matthew 24, 28. That refers to events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. You have to remember, Jesus says this: the temple, the temple you see standing here, not one stone will be left upon another; they'll all be torn down.
Right.
Then look at verse 29. So if everything up through verse 28 refers to that generation and the judgment of that generation, look at the very next verse. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the land will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Immediately after. So if you maintain that all the way up through Matthew 28 refers to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, verse 29 says, but immediately after that, not 2,000 years and counting after,
Right.
but you're stuck with this idea of the sun, moon, and stars language, and you ask yourself the question: where did Jesus get that language? He got it from the Old Testament. And if you look at the Old Testament, I think it's Ezekiel chapter 34, and I think Isaiah 32. You've got Isaiah chapter 13. Sun, moon, and stars go dark. The sun and moon go dark. The stars fall from heaven. That's Old Covenant language for judgment. And in Isaiah chapter 13, it's a judgment upon Babylon. So Jesus appropriates that language and applies it to that particular generation and the judgment on that generation. And what's interesting about this, sun, moon, and stars, what nation is actually described as sun, moon, and stars in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament? It's Israel. Genesis chapter 37, sun, moon, and stars bow down to Joseph. Revelation chapter 12, there's a woman, she stands on the moon. She's wrapped in the brightness of the sun, and she has a crown on her head with 12 stars. See, you're using the Bible to interpret the Bible. And people say, well, you're not taking the Bible literally. Well, so actually, I am interpreting the Bible literally, because to interpret the Bible literally is to interpret it according to its literature. And this is its literature. And it's, now this is not I'm not using a biblical argument here, but I'm just, think about every flag you've ever seen on every nation. And what do you notice on those flags? The United States. What do you notice on the United States flag? It has 50 of them, stars. If you go to Japan, what do you see? It's the sun. Muslim nations, what do you see? It's the moon. This is the nations were represented in terms of sun, moon, and stars. The Bible uses that same language and talks about when the sun is bright in the sky, when the moon is bright, because if the sun's not bright, the moon's not going to be bright, and stars. And that's a sign of blessing. But when the sun and moon go dark, that's a sign of judgment. When stars fall from the heavens, that's a sign of judgment as well. So you get to the book of Revelation. I had had a little exchange on the Christian Post site, and I was offering some comments to some things that Dr. Michael Brown had written about the end of the age. Mm-hmm. And I comment periodically with the people on this topic. And she said, well, where in the world were there 100-pound hailstones? Mm. That hasn't happened yet. And I said, so I may understand this. So you're saying that there will be literally 100-pound hailstones in the future that will take place. And then the next question I said, so you now believe that there is a giant woman out in space who's big enough to stand on the moon and fireproof enough to have, right, et cetera, et cetera. I know you believe that there is a dragon. There'll be a dragon who will, with the sweeping of his tail, throw down a third of the stars to earth. This is in Revelation chapter 12. In Revelation chapter 6, stars fall again. So you see, if you want to say you can take this literally, in Revelation chapter 6, stars fall like figs from a fig tree. Well, if stars fall to the earth, what's going to happen to the earth? If hailstones are supposed to be literal, then stars are supposed to be literal, and stars fall to the earth, what's going to happen to the earth? Well, before these stars even get close to the earth is going to be destroyed. Right. And then you've got chapter 6, you've got the earth destroyed, and then you get to chapter 12. I said, wait a minute, there's still, there's now a third of the stars are going to be thrown down. But after chapter 12, you got chapter 13 with these beasts. Wait a minute. You see how the problem there is with this type of hermeneutic. Let the Bible interpret the Bible. Pay attention to the time indicators. Time is near. These things must shortly take place. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. They're all through Scripture. And that's what I deal with in my book, Last Days Madness, and Wars and Rumors of Wars. Is Jesus Coming Soon? I have a new book out by James Jordan, who was a friend of mine, on Matthew chapters 23, 24, and 25. John Bray's book on Matthew 24, to show people, let the Bible interpret the Bible, and this isn't a new position at all.
Yeah. I think I was muted earlier. I was looking at something else. So I didn't, but I think I had said, when you mentioned the literature and the literal, I've used that multiple times, and that's changed me. I wouldn't say maybe rocked my world, but definitely being taught biblically and from many other good pastors and seminary and stuff. Context matters.
Yeah.
And what does this mean?
Audience relevance,
Yeah.
context, time indicators, comparing scripture with scripture. And it's the literature of the Bible has to be interpreted in terms of the literature of the Bible.
Right.
If you want to interpret me, you better read my material to know what I say, not what someone else says about my material, but what I actually say.
Yeah, and I think we know that, and yet somehow we often kind of put that view on the shelf. We'll divide up and kind of little individual compartments or something, because when we read poetry, it's poetry, or we read something from IKEA or Walmart, and we're looking at this and we're building a cabinet or something. We know what we're reading, or we know what they're reading, Twitter, right, or something, or a long book, or a note from your wife. It's the context and the literature, and when your wife says these words, you're interpreting them accordingly, versus somebody else 200 years ago might use a different word. Well, what does she mean? That's really good, because the sun, moon, and stars, all that stuff, I think people, I'm just taking it literally. I don't know, 1,000 years. I don't know.
Yeah, I always
and
say,
it's like,
what I'm the one taking it literally. Right. The word literal comes from the Latin litera, which means literature.
Yeah.
This is an interesting example. If you go to Psalm, I think it's Psalm 18. I think it's Psalm 18. And Psalm 18 is very interesting because it tells you what it's about. Psalm 18. It says, for the choir director, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So Psalm 18, and I think the parallel to this is 2 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 through 51. I think that's the case.
Yeah, I got a note here too.
All right. So Psalm 18, David tells us specifically what this is about. So what you need to do is you go back and you read what actually happened historically, and then you read the psalm and look what it says in verse 7. Then the earth shook and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up out of his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down with thick darkness under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and flew, and he sped upon the wings of the wind. Well, if you were to go back and read the historical account, guess what you wouldn't find? Any of these things mentioned.
Right.
So here is David explaining an historical event in a different type of literature. And the things in here, if I had read some of these things without the historical context of this, a lot of people would say, well, this is the description of the end of the world. But it wasn't. It was the description of a local battle in a particular area of Israel more than three millennia ago.
Right.
And then it says, verse 16, and he went from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters, he delivered me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. And so this type of literature isn't at all unusual.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's good. And I think, definitely for people listening, if it's like, well, it just doesn't, I just still don't, it's just, I'm taking it literally. Well, but according to what definition? Because like you just said, is this already said somewhere else? Like God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. That's the same type of thousand we see. Jesus reigns for 1,000 years, and that's you have that argument. Well, I just take the Bible literally, except for locusts are really helicopters, Apache helicopters, and they're this and they're that. And it's like, well, are you though? And not to make fun of anybody, but it's like you're using. I think you call it, what is it, newspaper exegesis, where you open up the paper, you open up Twitter, and you're scrolling through, and you're like, oh, this is happening. And I've seen stuff still periodically. I don't really follow any of the Michael Brown, Sid Roths, those types of guys, but other guys like John Macarthur and even more respected ones still have that view. And it's like, I don't know, not to get into personalities, but it's once you understand, especially something like Matthew 24 and Matthew 10 and so on, like, but what does the context say? Who is he writing to? Well, why is he writing this way? Who's speaking? And we do this with a lot of other passages, and we have no problem with it. And yet, all of a sudden, we extrapolate and think, fast forward 2,000 plus years. It's like, makes sense.
Yeah. And it's amazing to me. Again, I encounter a lot of people who are very, very bright people. I mean, I no disrespect to their intelligence at all.
Yeah.
But and I have to I understand that it's very difficult to change a theological position that you've been told for decades that it's the Bible. Right. This is what the Bible teaches, and I encounter that all the time from people who say, "Well, this is what the Bible teaches on this."
Right.
And I understand how difficult it is, for them to do that. But trying to get around what the text says is, to me, just an impossible task. And I'll give you a good example of this. You get to Matthew chapter 24, and we talk about audience relevance. In fact, if you were to follow, begin in Matthew chapter 21, and and every time the second person plural is used, make note of it and ask yourself this question. To whom is Jesus addressing? Is he addressing a specific audience, or is he addressing a general audience that this could apply to anyone? Now, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's the case that Jesus is like the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
But Jesus is describing particular events here. He's not just making theological points. He's describing particular events. And as I had mentioned, chapter 21, Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees in verse 42, and Jesus said to them, now here's the question, to them, who's the them? It's not us, them, it's them. Did you, not you, not me, you, did you, Jesus' specific audience, never read in the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord and is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I say to you, who? What you? Them you. The kingdom of God will be taken away from you and will be given to a nation producing the fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. Now listen to this next verse. And when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, see, this wasn't the only one, they understood that he was speaking about them. He's talking about them. Now, this doesn't mean this doesn't have any application to us, but this specific application at that time referred to them. Look at verse 6. They got so angry with this, and this is my point. You come across, you present something to somebody, they believed it for so many years, and then someone comes along like me and many others. I'm not the only one. Yeah. And I upturn their apple cart, and they get angry with me. The same thing happened to the apostle to Stephen. They got angry with him because he just went out and told them the truth. Yeah. And so look at verse 46. And when they sought to seize Jesus, they became afraid of the multitudes because they held him to be a prophet. And so Jesus was telling them the truth. So if you go through Matthew chapter 21, 22, 23, 24, the second person plural is used throughout. And if you look at Matthew chapter 24,
Was that with 21 you were just referencing?
That was 21:45.
Okay,
And
21.
so, Jesus,
now we're in 24. Okay.
So if you read chapter 23, it's obvious Jesus is talking about them. Things are going to happen to them. Behold, verse 38, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. And verse 24, verse 1. Keep in mind, there are no chapter divisions or verses mentioned. Chapter 24, Jesus came out from the temple, tells you where he was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, do you not see all these things? Not some future temple. Truly I say to you, not one stone here, not in the distant future of a rebuilt temple, which the New Testament doesn't say anything about. Not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, say, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, not the end of the world? And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. So far, the you here is them.
Wow. Yeah.
For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, etc., etc. Verse 6, and you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation. Now we're going all the way back to Matthew chapter 10. You, and they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. And Tim LaHaye says, well, the second person plural, everything up to verse 9 refers to them, but after that, the second person plural replies to a different future.
But why wouldn't he say that? That's the trouble. Why wouldn't he say this applies to you, but to them, there's ambiguity in certain places. Like, I have other sheep not of this fold, and the Mormons will take that and say, he's talking about people in America. That's one verse. Well, they'll just rip out of context.
Right.
But there are instances. This is where I apply even for people who think the Earth and the cosmos is millions and billions of years old. It's like, God could have easily used this as, the stars of the heavens, the sand of the sea. If he wanted to say this happened and took millions and billions of years, he could have easily used the same descriptive type illustrations to tell them. But no, he doesn't. Genesis 1, at the beginning, God created heavens and earth, and all the way down through day 7. And then he echoes that in Exodus 20 and many other places. It's like you're getting this and you're injecting it in. And I see this a lot with creation and just, the beginning times, as it were. And how people kind of manipulate the text and using outside stuff and sticking it in. It seems like that's what we're doing a lot of times with eschatology. We're taking outside stuff, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and this, and we're sticking these things in and saying, see, it fits here, here, and here, and Ezekiel and Daniel and so on. It's a good way to approach the Bible.
Then you look at verse 15. It says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, now Jesus had a future generation in mind. He was saying, now therefore, when they see the abomination of desolation spoken of from Daniel the prophet, standing in the new temple holy place, but it doesn't say that. Right. This is just talking about the same thing. And look at verse 33. Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that it is near, right at the door. Mm-hmm. So. And a lot of people, there are probably some people who listen to this right now say, well, I don't know. I've never heard this before. Wow. I would have to change my whole way of reading the Bible. And I would say, probably not the whole reading of the Bible, but certainly on eschatology, you need to do that. Jesus is talking about events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Yeah. And then you find guys saying, well, in fact, I had this debate online with a guy, it was the most convoluted way that he was trying to say that the phrase "this generation" that Jesus uses in Matthew chapter 24:34 did not apply just to that generation. And I it took me a while to even try to figure out what he was saying, and to this day I'm still not sure what he's saying. Wow. But every time this generation is used in Matthew's gospel, in Mark's and Luke's, it refers to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything else other than that. Now, if I said this generation may be in another war, and this time with China, this generation would refer to this generation. Jesus used this generation in his day. It referred to their generation.
Wow.
If Jesus had a future generation in mind, he could have said, "Now, truly I say to you, that generation or this future generation will not pass away until all these things take place."
Yeah.
This is, you don't have to go to seminary to figure this out. It's all there, and you notice I'm just using the Bible, and people will say, "Well, everybody uses the Bible to do that." Well, I will go through this verse by verse and use the Bible to do this, and I have done that. And very, very few people. I mean, I was down in Mexico going through all this, and it was interesting that the questions afterwards, we finally figured out that the questions that we got was they were trying to reconcile their last days stuff with what I was saying. Now, okay, what about this? What about? And I was saying, there is no Bible. There is no verse in the New Testament that says the temple is going to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
And people will say, well, it's implied. Well, once you go down that route, once you go down the route of saying this is implied and not specifically stated, for one of your cardinal doctrines, you have to have a rebuilt temple. And then to say, well, it's implied, I'm saying you have a real problem. And the rapture, too. People say, well, the Bible teaches a rapture. Well, I don't know what you have to tell me what you mean by that. There are 5 rapture positions.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's true.
And where is there a verse in the New Testament says the church is going to be taken off the earth before, during, or after a 7-year period? Where does it say that? And there is no verse that says that. There is no verse that says there's going to be a rebuilt temple. And yet, so much of today's prophetic utterances and the book sales are on that particular position, on passages of Scripture that don't exist.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. You will find one verse that talks about the virgin birth or the immaculate conception. One verse. And yet there are hundreds of verses that speak directly to this idea that these prophetic events were going to take place before that generation passed away. Words like near and shortly and quickly and at hand, about to, just on and on and on. And you'll believe one verse about Jesus, that Jesus was conceived in a very special way. I'm giving you 100 verses that say that these events are going to take place before that generation passed away. They were going to happen shortly, nearly, and so, and you won't believe it.
Yeah.
So I have to move on to other people who are more receptive,
more willing. And I think a lot of people who watch this and listen are at least curious. And I know some people have actually kind of shifted a bit, which is great. Where does, just real quick regarding, and we'll get to some other questions as far as comparison of a post-mill preterist or partial preterist view to other theological persuasions out there. Where does Daniel fit in? Give me like you're explaining this to a 12-year-old elevator pitch. Where does Daniel fit in? We got Thessalonians, we got Revelation, we got Matthew 24. There's a few other places that kind of people assemble their kind of sandcastle of eschatology, and sometimes it crumbles and falls. Sometimes it's contingent on one passage. Where does Daniel fit in?
Well, Daniel kind of lays out a history from his time period, I believe, to the first coming of Jesus. You see that in Daniel 2 and 3 with the statue, the four kingdoms, the fourth one being probably the Rome. You have the feet of iron mixed with clay. James Jordan says that is an indicator of Rome and Israel, the clay people, the people of the land, the potter's clay and so forth. they don't mix, they don't mingle.
Yeah.
You can't pull them together like water and oil, and takes you up to the time of the New Testament where the Jews actually colluded with the Romans to get Jesus crucified, and second during the book of Acts, it was the Jews who were trying to use the Romans to persecute the Christians and stop the Christians from spreading the gospel.
Right.
And then you have in John chapter 19, where you got Pilate saying, "Hey, do you want me to crucify your king?" And they said, "We have no king. We have no king but Caesar." And so Daniel deals with that particular time period, and the 70 weeks of years in Daniel chapter 9 take you up to the time of Jesus's ministry. Daniel, this 70th week, 7 years. First half of those that week of 3.5 years, Jesus' ministry, and then the next half, takes you up to, I don't know, maybe Stephen's execution, which would have, and here you have what's going to be the switch that's taking place here, that the gospel is going to go to the Gentiles. The Gentiles now, chapter 8.
Yeah.
Chapter 8, you have
8, 9,
Paul,
10. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul is persecuting, and this persecution that takes place sends the people out beyond into the world at large. And then chapter 9, end of chapter 9, you find that Peter is in Joppa. Joppa is the place where Jonah was trying to escape from God's command to take the gospel to the Ninevites. And you find Peter in Joppa, and he's with a tanner, somebody who deals with dead animals. This all fits together. In the very next chapter, God gives Peter a message. Brings the sheet that comes down out of heaven, unclean animals, take, kill, and eat. Peter says, "I've never eaten any unclean thing." God says, "Don't call unclean what I call clean." And he was talking about the gospel going to the Gentiles. So this all fits together here. So again, we're stuck within that particular time frame. Now Daniel's the 12th chapter is, and there's much more to Daniel. We have a commentary by James Jordan called "The Handwriting on the Wall." It's out of print. We're in the process of trying to get it back into print. I have a series on Daniel. If you go to American Vision, I have a 12 lesson series on Daniel, as well as outlines for each chapter. So if you want to get a full orb discussion of this, you can get that. But if you read Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, "But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the time of the end," not the end of time, but the time of the end. And there are many ends in Scripture.
Yeah.
"Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase." Now, it doesn't say information will increase, that it's the computer time. It says knowledge will increase, and that is, as it gets closer to the coming of the time of the Messiah, knowledge about that is going to increase. That's why you had Anna and Simeon anticipating this. Right. You had the wise men anticipating this. So knowledge will increase. And then verse 9, "And the angel said, 'Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the time of the end.'" Now that's an important point. This is sealed up. But if you read the book of Revelation, what is John told not to do? He's told, don't seal it up, because the time is near. These things are going to take place soon. These things are about to take place. If you read Revelation chapter 2, John is said to have been a fellow partaker in the tribulation. These things must shortly take place, for the time is near. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, Revelation chapter 22, verse 10. The book of Revelation was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's what this is all about.
Yeah.
So, so the book of Daniel kind of is a lead up to what we see in the coming of Jesus. And then the book of Revelation unseals all of this, and knowledge is increased even more as you read the New Testament about all of these things happening to covenant Israel and what God is going to do to covenant Israel in terms of judgment, and then open up the gospel to the world. So the gospel went out to every. The gospel was proclaimed to every creature under heaven. Colossians 1:23.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's good. And I get this a lot, and I've actually had this myself, just kind of curious, like, well, what's the difference? NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, there's a lot of, kind of charismatic-y people and, Bill Johnson, Bethel, those types of people. A lot of these people have TV shows or these types of folks.
Right.
And a lot of times they're talking about, a lot of times they seem to be premill or premill dispensational, whatever. But there's this view that the 7 hills or the 7 mountains, of course, representational of these different things, entertainment, news, politics, isn't just, kind of play devil's advocate here, isn't just this kind of a fancy theological, highbrow version of that. Isn't post-mill stuff like, we're going to go conquer the world, we're going to conquer for Christ? Because this is something I hear a lot, like, well, you can't make people believe in Jesus, you can't convert people by force, we're not Muslims, blah blah blah. What is the difference between partial preterism, most of this stuff's fulfilled, / post-millennialism, where things are getting better, for lack of a better word, and the NAR?
Well, I've been in. I'm not part of the charismatic movement, but for some reason this. I don't like the word postmillennialism, but people use it, and typically you would find in charismatic circles more kingdom. They talk about the kingdom, which I think is a better approach to all this, because the Bible, the Apostle Paul at the end of the book of Acts is preaching the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And the kingdom is God's domain. He rules over the kingdom. He's ruling over it now. John the Baptist said, "The kingdom of God is at hand. It's close." So that's a reality. We don't bring in the kingdom. We are living in the midst of God's kingdom, and there are kingdom rebels and there are kingdom faithful, and we are engaged in that. In charismatic circles, when people talked about all this and they embraced the type of talk that we engaged in, and they had rejected the dispensationalism to a certain extent, they still held on to a lot of last days type stuff.
Right.
But they gravitated away from it. I know a number of people who were in a lot of that and got out of it. I think there's a lot of, I hate to use this word, but it's kind of magic. If we believe this stuff, we really put our energy behind it and believe it, these things will take place. Now, this idea of the 7 mountains and the entertainment and so forth and so on, I think that's absolutely legitimate. Antonio Gramsci, who was a communist of a different breed, he talked about, communism was this forced compliance into a worldview, where Antonio Gramsci said, no, you want to change people, you need to go through what he described as the long march through the institutions. Mm-hmm. And that meant entertainment and politics, education, the media, journalism, and so forth and so on. Gramsci was absolutely right. And this is something that Christians used to believe. I mean, you think about Christianity and science. We wouldn't have science today if it hadn't been for Christianity. Some of the greatest scientists of our era and beyond and before were in fact Christians, because they understood that the world was created by God and operated in terms of certain fixed laws. And so if you did an experiment today, you did that same experiment the next day with the same temperature, same atmospheric pressure, and all that, you would get the same result, because God created the world that way. And so journalism. I mean, journalism, the idea of truth telling in journalism was a Christian idea.
Mm.
Music, art, all of this, media. I mean, Jesus was a media phenomenon.
Mm.
You think about the crowds that he had. He didn't have the press on his side. He would get in a boat. I remember teaching this to a class. I taught a Christian school, a worldview class, and they always wondered why I always could hear everything they were saying. They said, Mr. Demar, how we were just whispering over here. I had to laugh. I hated to tell them this. It was my little secret. But the first class I taught, we sat at a huge round wooden table. So they were all around me in this wooden table.
Mm.
And I would stand and I would teach them. It was a great experience for me and for them, because they were all newbies. They came into this, they knew nothing. And it was kind of fun.
Wow. And
I said, well, let me tell you, when you whisper, your whisper is bouncing off this hard table and I'm hearing it. It's like a sounding board.
Yeah.
And so Jesus, he goes into a boat, calm sea, people probably on the shore, maybe a little bit of sand dune or whatever they had back then. And Jesus is talking, and the reason they could hear him is because his voice was hitting the water and sound waves bouncing up, and they could hear him. But Jesus went speaking everywhere. I mean, everything that you're seeing today, Christians used to be involved in. Wow. I have a new book coming out called The Case for America's Christian Heritage. I have another book called American, what's it called? America's Christian History, The Untold Story. And these books go through and show every college in the colonies, education in the colonies were based on Christianity. The Harvard and Yale and what today is Princeton and Columbia, which was before, all of these were Christian institutions. The political side of things, all of the state constitutions were either specifically Christian, many of them were specifically Protestant. Even Rhode Island had religious elements to it as well. North Carolina, you couldn't hold, you weren't qualified to hold office in North Carolina unless you believed in the authority of both the Old and the New Testaments. So yeah, so they're right. They're right about all those things.
The NAR you're talking about?
Yeah, we gave all of those things away because we believe that it's not spiritual to be involved in those things. That's number one. We should all be only about preaching the gospel. And number two is knowledge is neutral. Scientific knowledge is neutral. Mathematics is neutral. Political knowledge is neutral. These are neutral realms. We fell into that trap as well. There's not a single neutral atom in the cosmos, and Christians better understand this. That neutrality is a myth. Everything is interpreted by a certain worldview. Christians used to interpret the world in terms of that worldview, and so look what's happened. Homosexuality, transgenderism, the new religion. This is basically a new religion. You don't comply with this, you could lose your job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so Christians bought into the idea of neutrality, or we can't impose our morality on other people. In fact, I just read an article somewhere about how Jerry Falwell made a huge mistake with the moral majority because you can't impose your morality on other people. And I'm going to tell you this: every law is an imposition to someone's view of morality.
Right.
What we as Christians understood at one time, there are certain things that the civil government cannot be involved in terms of morality, and other things that the civil magistrate should be involved in terms of morality. But we've been told, there's a separation between church and state. Well, it depends on what you mean by that. I believe there's a jurisdictional separation between church and state. They say, well, Jesus didn't get mixed up in politics. Oh, really? He was only described as the king, the king of kings. He called Herod that fox. He asked for a coin whose image is on it. I mean, give me a break. You got two books of the Bible called Kings. And yeah, so you've got this thing, and then of course the eschatological issue here. You got Christians who maintain we're living in the last days. Why bother with all this? Because it's all going to, it's all going to be destroyed. Why polish brass on a sinking ship? The Titanic is going down.
Mm-hmm.
So this, you put all this is a witch's brew of abdication of responsibility. And so here's what happened: the secularists took over all of these various areas and are now enforcing that compliance on us. So they've got the kind of the superstructure right, but what they don't have are the specifics on how to do this. And you have to do it's hard work. Now, if you're going to get involved in politics, it's not an easy thing to do. If you want to be a scientist, you're going to have to go to school and study. It's not magic. If you want to get into the arts, if you want to get into communications and journalism, we as Christians need to be involved in doing that. So there's nothing wrong with that and doing it. It's just about how they think about how it's going to take place. It's not going to drop out of heaven. It's going to be done by hard work.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to sell. Selling responsibility. You can't even give responsibility away. So try to sell it to people. It just doesn't work. And so there's always this idea. I've got friends who are saying, we're going to raise $20 million to produce a movie that's going to change Hollywood. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I mentioned I was at the funeral of Marshall Foster, and Ted Baer was there. Ted Baer, if you're not familiar with Ted Baer in Movie Guide, Ted has been involved in the whole movie industry for decades. And he'll tell you it's hard work and what you have to do in order to do this, and how long it took him to gain a voice and a hearing in Hollywood. See, that's what you have to do. And it's not just one guy doing this, but it's hundreds of people in various fields doing this. No one person, no one group, no one movement is going to be your salvation. This has to be a collective. It's got to be a collection of things, and that's how the liberals have taken over. The left, the LGBTQ 75, alphabet soup. That. How do you think they did this? They did it through hard work. Yeah. They have media outlets and pressure groups and so forth. All they have to do is just send something out, and someone will apologize on the spot for something that they said, because this group will go in there and attack them. And they are a minority in this culture. Christians have tens of millions of people, and they're sitting back and going, "Woe is me." They are the same type of people where Moses sends out 12 spies into the land of Canaan. God had told them, Numbers chapter 13, this is the land I'm going to go give you. Go spy out the land, come back, and so forth. And of course, the story. The story is that the 12 spies come back. 10 of the spies say, "Oh, there are giants in the land. There are giants in the land." And there were giants in the land. Mm-hmm. Joshua and Caleb come back and never disagreed with the report that there were giants in the land. The spies even brought back the produce of the land. It's really a land flowing with milk and honey. I mean, look at this grape bunch. It takes 2 men in order to carry this bunch of grapes. So 40 years wasted in the wilderness because the people went along with the 10 spies, wanted to return to Egypt. This task is too big. 40 years wasted in the wilderness. Then you get to the book of Joshua. 2 spies, Rahab, who never saw none of this, said, when we heard what God had done, our hearts melted within us. They perceived themselves to be, is that right? They perceived themselves to be the grasshoppers and the Israelites to be the giants. And 40 years earlier, it was the Israelites who perceived themselves to be the grasshoppers and the people of the land to be the giants. And this is where we are today. It's hard work, and hard work is not, it's hard. That's why there was a book that came out a number of years ago do hard things. You want to get a hard body, lift heavy stuff. You want to change the culture, it's going to take some heavy lifting to do it.
Yeah. I guess just to wrap up, just for super clarity for some people, because they might be like, well, I still don't understand the difference. Why are the NAR guys, apostles, all that, kind of stuff? What is the kind of main difference between, say, the church you're a part of and an NAR church, for example, and like the views that are, well, yeah, we must conquer and do this, and that's kind of that positive.
Yeah, look, positivity.
View.
Positivity is great. I mean, I don't have a problem with positivity.
Yeah.
I think everybody ought to have it. But there's certain circumstances you can be positive about, but it still takes a great deal of work to do. But you got to know the specifics of how things to work. I asked the question, what's inflation? Give me a definition of inflation. Most people say, well, inflation is higher prices. No, it's not. That's not the definition. Definition of inflation is an increase in the money supply, which causes higher prices. And I asked the question, who's in control of the money supply? Right? Well, governments are. Oh, so governments are in control of their money supply. So they're the ones that actually cause higher prices through inflation by well, the Bible uses this phrase that your silver has become dross and your wine diluted with water. And so it's just like they just pour all this money into the economy. And then you start asking people, how much involved are you in government programs? How much do you want this program? How much do you want government education? Are you willing to take your kids out of government schools and educate them either at home or your church start a school, or you start a school? Are you willing to do that? Because it's going to cost you to do that. It means maybe a smaller house. Maybe you have to drive your car for a few more years. So you got to get educated in what to do. You've got to maybe make some tremendous lifestyle choice changes. You need to know the specifics of how things work in order to make those types of changes. Now, if these people are doing all of that, I don't have a problem with it. But then they need to understand the jurisdictional separation between church and state. What things should civil magistrate be doing, and what things shouldn't the civil magistrate be doing? And that takes some expertise as well. So it's not enough to be optimistic. It's not enough to be engaged. You have to understand the specifics on how things work. And I always use this illustration. I say, if today you became president of the United States and you had to fill all of these different cabinet positions, who would you choose to do that? And this is what happened to Donald Trump. Donald Trump becomes president, and what was he left with? He was left with these bureaucrats, these establishment people who are so bound up in government and making money and power that it was hard to find people out there who would be willing to do this, because a lot of people said, I'm not leaving my good job over here to go and become a government bureaucrat. But see, what we need to do in terms of civil government, we need to decrease the power of the civil government. That means people are going to have to say no to government. And many of them aren't willing to do that. They don't have the specifics on how to implement what they are optimistic about, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, it's good. Thank you. What are some of the views? So looking, not to get back into Matthew 24 necessarily, but a lot of people read that and think, well, this is going to happen. This is still in our future, versus being the future of the people who were first reading that and writing and so on. What, just point blank, what other things, prophecies, things need to happen before Christ returns? Is there anything? I mean, we see Acts 1, he ascends and he's going to come back in the same way, right? The two men there.
People put so much stock in the second coming of Christ, and I always tell people, I say, I know you don't want to hear this, but the next eschatological event in your future is your death. That's the reality. And here we are. People always say, well, what about the second coming of Christ? Don't worry. Why are you worried about the second coming of Christ? You were responsible right here. As I mentioned to you earlier, I've been to I've seen a lot of my friends, die this year,
Hmm.
and last year too. And so, and replacements for those. This funeral, I was up in Franklin, Tennessee, with Marshall Foster, and Kirk Cameron got up to speak. They were very good friends, and he said, "Okay, who are the replacements? Who's going to replace Marshall Foster?" I don't know if you can see this book behind me in my library up here, to the left of me, to the right of my head. There's a book that says, has Van Til, a big thick book up there,
Yeah. Hmm.
by Greg Bahnsen. Greg Bahnsen was probably the greatest apologist of the 20th century. If you haven't watched his debate with Gordon Stein, called The Great Debate, that was done in the 1980s, you need to listen to it. It's a tremendous debate. Greg Bahnsen was a brilliant guy, but he died at 47 years of age. David Chilton, one of the best writers on Bible prophecy. Paradise Restored. If you don't have Paradise Restored, you need to get it. You don't have Days of Vengeance, you need to get it. David died at a very, very young age. That's the next eschatological event in your lifetime. Now, it does, just because Matthew 24, the events of Matthew 24 have been fulfilled, doesn't mean that there aren't going to be wars. There have been wars. It doesn't mean that there might not be famines. And if you read Acts chapter 11, there were famines throughout the entire Roman Empire in that day. There have been famines. We've had COVID. Now we've got monkeypox. We got all these things. We've always had these things. We had the bubonic plague, killed tens of millions of people.
Yeah.
People just gravitate. We've had wars and rumors of wars before. But the wars and rumors of wars Jesus was talking about were the wars and rumors of wars in his generation, and they really weren't signs. The real sign that took place is that the Son of Man was vindicated and was seated in the heavens. That was the true sign. And the outward manifestation of that sign was the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. God has called us to get to work in his kingdom, in his vineyard, in his garden. Quit being preoccupied with the end. And
that's good.
You're not going to be raptured out of here. I'm just going to tell you, it's not going to happen. The second coming, look, get off the second coming stuff. Everybody who has died before you did not experience the second coming. You're not any better off than they are. If you believe the gospel, when you die, you go to heaven to be with Jesus. That's your next thing. It's appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. Hey, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27. That's the next eschatological event in your future, my future, and the people who are listening to this in their future.
Yeah.
So get to work for your children, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren. It was a funeral on Sunday on the 31st. I was at a funeral on Friday. My wife's mother, 99 years old, died, but she left behind 3 children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. I've got nine grandchildren, and you want to change the world? Have lots of children, train them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, educate them, get them involved in every area of life. It's going to take time. We got into this mess. It took a long time to do it. It's going to take us a while to get out of it. And don't think it's hard, but what's going to rescue me is going to be the rapture or the second coming. People have been thinking that. Well, we talked about Hal Lindsey. He said it was all going to come to an end in 1988. And here we are in 2022.
Yeah.
More than 70 years since Israel became a nation again in 1948. I think it's what, 74? Is that 74 years? I mean, think about that. So that, the kingdom stuff, the 7 mountains and so forth and so on, unless you have knowledge and specifics and work hard, none of that's going to come to pass.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. So Christ is returning, but we don't need to be so preoccupied with it. I guess maybe some questions that I would probably be asking, especially if it was a pre-mill sort of view, but I'm questioning this and this and this, and those are good points with Matthew 24 and so on. A lot of people will think because it's going from bad to worse, it's we're crashing and burning, the polish on the Titanic. Why even bother? And that's very true. I completely 100% agree with you. That really has been the bane for the last multiple decades, if not the last 100 years. What then? what's gonna happen? Just to pique curiosity, what will happen? Not for people to dwell on it, right? But
I don't have
when
any.
Christ
I don't
does,
have any specifics. I don't have any specifics as what's going to happen or when anything's going to happen. I don't know.
definitely not the win. Yeah, I mean, we're not
That's
getting into
not
that.
my.
That's silly, yeah.
That's not my concern. What my I talk about circles of responsibility. We all have circles of responsibility. If you know yourself and self-government, your family and family government, your church and church government, business, the arts, every area of life. We we get involved. You have certain gifts and talents. Exercise those things and go out into the world and change things. And I use this illustration before. I read a book that talked about if you had a sheet of paper, and folded it in half 50 times. All right. Now you couldn't do it physically. You can't do it physically. But if you could fold it in half 50 times, and you would have put that piece of paper on the earth, how high would it be? So you take a sheet of paper, fold it in half. Not very significant. Take the next, and then take that half, fold that again. So you get one sheet, you go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, depending on the thickness of the paper, just take one sheet of paper, fold it in half 50 times. You can do this on your calculator. And 2 to the 50th power. It would go from Earth probably 2/3 of the way to the sun in height and thickness. All right. So what starts off as being very insignificant, one sheet of paper, and folding that sheet 1, 2, 4, 8, 6, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
All the levels. Yeah.
It becomes unbelievable. So if I do my stuff in my area of the circle of responsibilities, and you do yours, and everybody out there do theirs, you change the society. And that's how the left got to where it is today. They understood the principle. That Antonio Gramsci understood it. Christians didn't. They still have this folded sheet. They still have one sheet of paper, and they're waiting for somebody to write, the rapture on it, or the second coming, or whatever the case might be. And God's telling you, fold the paper.
That's good. No, that's good.
And so, I mean, yeah. Look, this is not easy stuff. We didn't get here. Again, back to my mother-in-law, and she was born in 1922. 1922. 5 years from World War I. 19 years from when the Wright brothers flew their first plane. Think of that. So from 1903 to 1969, Wright brothers flew their Wright Flyer, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1903. We put 2 men on the moon in 1969. Think of that. So there were people around in 1969 who in 1902 were alive and had never seen an airplane fly. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, how did that happen? It didn't happen magically. A whole bunch of people were involved in that process of doing all that. And you got to think of that for every single area of life. And that's what God has called us to do. And I'm telling you, the eschatologies we have today are pitiful and harmful. And we need to get out of it. And the worldview, that's why I wrote a book called Thinking Straight in a Crooked World. I also wrote a book called Myths, Lies, and Half-Truths. You read those books along with the eschatology stuff, or transform your lives, or transform the lives of your children. You've got to give your children something to believe in and to work toward. And if you keep hammering this end time nonsense into them, it's going to stymie their ability to think long term and work hard term. Because I guarantee you, the other side isn't thinking about being raptured out of here. What they're thinking about is imposing their worldview that they worked on very, very hard upon you to do their bidding. So, and no rapture is going to get you out of this. You're going to have to do it. You're going to have to do it and work on it.
And they've got an eschatology. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, we see this.
Every worldview has an eschatology.
Yeah.
Francis Nigel Lee wrote a book called Communist Eschatology, and it was about 5 inches thick.
Wow.
The Muslims have an eschatology.
Right.
Liberals have an eschatology. Adolf Hitler had an eschatology.
Yeah.
The
1,000-year
1,000-year
reign of
right.
right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Right.
your
Yeah.
children don't belong to you; they belong to us, and we'll train them in the new way of viewing. Education today is messianic. R.J. Rushdoony wrote a book called "The Messianic Character of American Education." It's messianic. Why do you think there's such an impact on what's happening in public education today? Get your kids out of these schools. If you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to pay the price of what it takes to educate your children yourself, then you have no business to complain about anything. Because if you can't take the responsibility for your own kids and training them, I don't know what you think you're going to change the world, because you're not. And so your many fallback position is, well, Jesus is going to come back and rapture me and so forth. Well, they didn't rapture any of my friends who died this year. And so this didn't rapture anybody for the thousands of years that people have been on earth. So anyway, that's Gary Demar's medicine bottle for the day.
Wonder
what
tonic.
you need to take to change the world.
It's good.
Gary North, it was a good friend of mine. He died this year, and he says people will try everything in the medicine cabinet before they try this. And it's the worldview that I am describing now. They'll try everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And then you always had these medicine men that would travel around the countries trying to sell their elixir to fix things. And it was basically poison. And that's what people, I'm going to try this one. Maybe that'll work. I'll try this, so that'll work. No, it's not going to work.
Wow.
What's going to work is become responsibility and apply God's word to every area of life, and unhitch yourself from all of the things that are inhibiting you from doing that, and then begin to make a change in what's taking place governmentally. And that means self-government, family, church, and civil government. And I don't mean getting involved in civil government in order to we use the power of the state to tax people more and to use our pet projects. That's not what I'm saying. We get involved politically in order to decrease the power of the civil government, return our money to us, and let us do with our money what we want to do with our money. My one son pays $12,000 in property taxes. He has 5 children to educate, and he could use that. You know, I'm not saying that all taxes are wrong for fire and police and so forth, but it could be paid a completely different way.
Yeah,
they double tax that. If you want to send your children to a public school, you're double taxed. So anyway, we could talk about this forever, but I've got to go too. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it. One last question regarding the flag, Pledge of Allegiance, all that. Where do you stand on having those type of things?
I mean,
just curious.
Pledge of Allegiance was originally started by a socialist. I don't know if you know that or not.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It was, and then the One Nation Under God was actually added much later into the 50s because of the advance of communism, atheistic communism. It's hard to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America today because it's so corrupt. Now, you want to pledge allegiance to what America could be. Okay, that's fine. I don't think it's a sacred thing that we ought to be doing. You got churches out there that got the American flag in the church sanctuary. Mm-hmm. I say get it out. Mm. We are ambassadors for Christ on earth, and the church is a representation of that of our government. Is ecclesiastical government. Church government is just as legitimate as civil government, but in an ecclesiastical way. Mm-hmm. We believe in a jurisdictional separation between church and state. It's time that we make that jurisdictional separation. There's a church that had a dispute, and there was a group not winning that dispute, and so they ended up decided they were going to go to a judge over, and they ended up taking it to a judge, and they got 2 lawyers and a judge. Completely unbiblical to do that. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And I have to say, the judge and the 2 lawyers who were representing these 2 sides, one side didn't want to go. They were forced to go because the other side was forcing anyway. And the judge and the two lawyers said, "What are we doing here? This isn't legitimate here. This judge and these two lawyers have better sense than this one group of churchgoers on how you deal with church-state jurisdictional separation." So there's a lot we have to unlearn and relearn. And I, again, get my book Myths, Lies, and Half-Truths, where I deal with a bunch of those things.
Yeah.
So,
no, I appreciate it, Gary. I'll put those links in the description. You mentioned obviously multiple books and other
AmericanVision.org. If anyone is interested, AmericanVision.org. I do 2 articles a week, and I do three podcasts a week. Books galore, electronic versions of them, printed versions of them. Website is loaded with articles. If you're interested in eschatology specifically,
lots of questions answered. Yeah.
I've got a book. I have a new website called Last Days Madness.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, everything's available online. And if I always tell people, if you read one of my books, and if you ask me a question, and I'll say, look, it's in this book, and I don't make any royalties on any of my books. I'm not selling books for me to have royalties.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to read, I'm not willing to come back answer questions that are already answered. Myths, Lies, and Half-Truths. The chapters are independent of one another. You can read them as you want. Wars and Rumors of Wars is a relatively short book. You don't have to read it all at one sitting. Almost every eschatological question you have, has been answered. If there's an eschatological question that you have, and I can point you to a book, I will do that. And if there's an eschatological question that has not been answered, I'll do my best in order to answer it. But again, all of this is you can contact me at AmericanVision.org, and you can support at AmericanVision.org will get to me. But you're going to have to do some work.
Yeah. You're on Twitter and Gab as well, correct?
I guess I am. Someone else handles all that for me.
Okay.
So. I'm on most platforms. The podcasts, they come out
Apple Podcasts,
say 3 days a week, and I've got some good new interviews. I got this short interview with Kirk Cameron and how his eschatological position has changed, and that I don't know when that's going to go up. I think I just got the edited version of it. So anyway, AmericanVision.org.
All right, Gary. Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a blessed day.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
God bless.